Okay, so at this point, we've talked mostly about idiographic approaches and talked about a lot of approaches that are based in part on conjecture and assumptions of the researchers and clinicians involved. But I want to shift to a much more empirical, sort of data-based approach to personality. So this is the perspective that focuses on stable traits that we can measure in people. So this is, as opposed to the idiographic stuff we've talked about, this is nomothetic because it has to do with taking groups, looking at consistencies between them and how we can measure things. So the goals of these types of approaches are to think about classes of behaviors and tendencies that define different personality traits and identify individual differences that we can measure among people. And if we have measurement of different aspects of personality, different traits and cognitive styles and things like that, then we can probably understand and predict their behavior in some way. Maybe that depends on situations. We know that, remember, traits and personality and situations interact with one another. So it's important not to think that knowing personality is going to allow you to know everything about someone's behavior, but it will allow you to understand something about it. So when I say personality trait, I'm talking about relatively stable cognitive, emotional, and behavioral characteristics of people that help establish their identities and distinguish them from other people. So there are things about us that we, might share with other people to some extent, but everyone's along different continua or continuums of these different traits. So how do we figure out what these are? This is something early personality researchers had to deal with. Like, what should we measure? What is important to measure? And there is an idea known as the lexical hypothesis. Lexical just meaning like related to words and language, that suggests that all meaningful ways that we could possibly use to differentiate people should be based in the language that we use. How could we, use these or identify these things if we didn't have something to call them? So we should look to our languages, look to dictionaries, literally, to figure out the different traits that people might have. So where do you start? How do you do that? I want you to think for a second about the different types of questions we might ask people. And imagine you had a list like this. These are not personality questions. This is a separate example to help you understand a different concept. So consider these questions. How tall are you? How many minutes do you spend reading a newspaper each day? With your feet on the ground, how high can you reach? Do you listen to National Public Radio? How much do you weigh? How many times a week do you watch headline news? So as you look at those different questions, some commonalities and some differences should be jumping out at you. You should see some similarities between questions 1, 3, and 5, and some similarities between questions 2, 4, and 6, right? They're on the same list, but they're measuring different things. And the common things that 1, 3, and 5, and 2, 4, and 6 are measuring are not exactly the same, but they might be tapping the same sorts of dimensions. So how many things are we measuring with these 6 questions? Some of them are related broadly to body size, weight, height. Some of them are related to attention to media. So how often you do certain things, if you engage in some particular media consumption. So a way that you might be able to reduce those things, if you can't look at them and recognize, what they're tapping into, would be to use a statistical approach called factor analysis. Factor analysis is going to it's going to identify dimensions, latent dimensions among questions. So if you put those 6 items into a factor analysis, it would probably return to you that there are 2 dimensions. One that has to do with body size, one that has to do with attention to media. Now, it's not going to label those for you and tell you this is body size, this is attention to media. It's just going to say these are 2 dimensions. And then you would notice, oh, these ones seem to have to do with body size. These ones seem to have to do with attention to media. So this broad statistical approach is how you can reduce the number of dimensions, number of traits that we might use to describe people. Now, the early attempts at this from Gordon Allport, somebody we talked about in the social psych unit, and a collaborator in the 30s, found over 18,000 words in an English dictionary describing people. Obviously, that's untenable. You can't have that many traits and talk about them in a meaningful way. Another familiar name, Cattle, who we talked about as also simplifying some ideas about intelligence and reducing them to different nested specificities of intelligence. Cattle reduced this list to around 35 categories in the 60s. Then more recently, in the 90s, McCrae and Costa narrowed this down into 5 different clusters, found that among these 35 categories, there were sort of 5 dimensions among those 35 categories. And those 5 clusters might be familiar to you today as the big 5 personality traits. So these are emotional stability, which used to be called neuroticism. That is, first of all, maybe a little bit pejorative, and also it was kind of coded backwards from some of the other ones, so they started calling it emotional stability. Ones that might be more familiar, or things that you might think about in your everyday lives: extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. So these are the 5 personality traits that seem to be the most consistent and reliable among people, and even across cultures. And I don't want to go too much detail about any one of them at this point, but they're all very important things for different domains in life. Now, they might not all be super important for everything. For example, if you wanted to look at what personality traits are related to political ideology, you would find that people who are high in conscientiousness and also low in openness to new experiences are more likely to be conservative. So conscientiousness is positively related to conservatism, openness is negatively related to conservatism. But there's a little bit of a correlation there with agreeableness being related to liberalism, but extroversion and emotional stability or neuroticism don't really seem to have much to do with it. So we can use these personality traits to kind of understand more about other aspects of psychology and social sciences. So these do seem to be the most basic pieces of personality, these traits. They are real in the sense that they are stable over time. You can measure them in the same people and they will remain relatively stable. And most researchers agree that these traits exist in a meaningful way and predict important things about our behavior and how we perceive things about our environments. No matter what kind of data you're using, basically, to study personality, these traits are going to tend to emerge, these 5 in particular. So this isn't just something McCrae and Costa came up with. This is something that people find again and again, that these are important personality traits. And they don't seem to differ that much across cultures. What I mean by that is not that everyone across, the average amount of agreeableness is the same in every culture. There is variance rather in different cultures. For example, more collectivistic cultures are going to be more conscientious and less open to new experiences, and individualistic cultures might be less agreeable. But they're universal in the sense that all cultures seem to have these dimensions that people vary along. The means might differ across cultures, but you can put someone from any culture along the continuum of these different traits. Very interestingly, they also have a biological basis. They're heritable. We know from twin studies and other types of research that at least part of our personality, these big 5 traits, seem to come from our genes. That it's not the case like any other trait that you get exactly what your parents had or whatever, but these things are heritable to some extent, and that might be part of what leads us to interact with our environment in different ways, that leads our genes to express themselves when we kind of find a match with our environment and our personality. So very important traits that are very consistent, but it's also important to remember they don't describe everything. Not everything about a person can be lumped into emotional stability, agreeableness, openness, extroversion, and conscientiousness. There are just different things about people. So the big 5 are maybe the most basic, broad traits about people. They're supposed to be broad, though, because the people that designed this were trying to reduce the number of dimensions from 18,000, then to 35, then to 5. They're supposed to be broad. Even when you measure a big 5, there are different numbers of items you can use to do it. one measurement called the Big Five Aspect Scale that has 100 items, has 20 items for every one of the Big Five. And within those 20 items, there are items that tap different aspects, the Big Five aspects, different aspects of these traits. So there are ways you can break down openness into like imagination and trying new things. There are sub traits that you can get more specific with, but of course there are also things that are just not captured by Big Five personality, like your cognitive style, whether you prefer closure, or whether you are someone who likes to think, or whether you're someone who likes to evaluate things. These things might be related to the Big Five traits, but they might also not be fully described by them. The Big Five traits also are about description, not explaining anything about personality. They're just saying, here's where people lie on this continuum, and this is what we might expect from them. And in a pure sense, this perspective doesn't really think too much about how the traits interact with one another. They kind of think about them separately. But you can imagine how someone who's open to experience and extroverted is probably a very different person from someone who's open to experience and introverted, right? The way those things interact are going to have real impacts on how those different personality traits express themselves. So again, this is very descriptive. You can use it, though, to predict things about people, and it's very basic by design. Now, if we want to get more complicated and think about how much interaction there is between different traits, as well as your genes and your environment, we might want to think about more social cognitive type theories about personality. So these are just broadly ideas that do take that stuff into account. A thinking, active human being is interacting with its social environment and learning from that social environment. So there is what we would call reciprocal determinism in this type of theory, where the person, so their personality characteristics, their skills, the way that they think, those things are affecting the environments they choose and the behaviors they want to engage in. But their behaviors are also feeding back on their skills and the person that they're like. And their behaviors are leading them to choose different environments. And their environments are reinforcing things about their personality. And their environments are prescribing different possible behaviors. So all these things are far from separate. They are all influencing one another in both directions all the time. So social cognitive theories would say you can't study personality without thinking about people's environment and their behavior. So if you think about a particular type of behavior, which is kind of a silly one, let's think about bungee jumping, for example. There might be different ways that that behavior is influenced by your personality and by the environment you choose to be part of. So if you're someone that has a high sensation seeking and high risk taking set of personality characteristics, maybe that's going to lead you to want to learn to bungee jump. But maybe if your environment doesn't have friends that want to learn how to bungee jump with you, then you don't end up engaging in that behavior because something about your social environment is not promoting that. But maybe that is something that you stick with and you want to try it. So you seek out more friends. So because of your traits and the behaviors you would like to engage in, you change your social environment. And that change in your social environment then affects your personality. It might reinforce your sensation-seeking and risk-taking behaviors, and it might lead you to be able to choose to bungee jump. So if you think about one of these things in a vacuum, you're not going to have a full understanding of how they work or how they all fit together. Another social cognitive theory that is a little less expansive is from someone named Julian Rotter. This is an idea that we have different expectancies and have different reinforcement values. So this is basically just how likely are we to engage in a behavior, and this calls back to some ideas from learning, of course. But we have expectancies of how likely a consequence will occur, like let's stick with bungee jumping, that you get injured or die. And your reinforcement value has to do with how much you want or dread that outcome. How afraid are you of an injury? Does that influence your decision making? So these expectancies and how much reinforcement value we attach to them are another way that our personality characteristics interact with our environment, because our expectancies and how much those outcomes matter to us in the positive or negative direction are all things that are very much informed by your personality and your environment and your behavior, all kind of fitting these things together again. This all also kind of depends on how much control you really have over your environment. And that varies from person to person, but the experience of that and the perception of that also varies from person to person. So we vary. You might consider a personality trait in a broad sense to be the locus of control, or the locus of control to be an example of a personality trait, rather, that we vary in this. It's a continuum again. Some people are going to feel like they have a more internal locus of control and they control their own behavior and outcomes and destiny. Other people might have a more external locus of control, thinking that they don't have much control over their decisions or where they go or where they end up in life. So obviously, this is another thing that's influenced by your environment. If you're born, let's say, in a high socioeconomic strata, you might feel like you have more control over your destiny, whereas someone who is born in a lower socioeconomic stratum might feel like they don't have many choices because they have to engage in X, Y, and Z behaviors for their family and things like that. But that's not always going to be the case, right? Maybe there are certainly people higher in socioeconomic terms that feel like they don't control their environments and vice versa. But people that have a more internal locus of control are going to predictably behave in a more self-determined fashion, like they have more choice. And they're going to have better outcomes frequently, like not giving into social influences easily and engage in behaviors that are going to make them healthier, like stopping smoking or changing their diet or engaging in exercise more than people that have an external locus of control. Internal is associated with good, sort of agentic types of behaviors. External is more like fatalistic. And it's not necessarily that either one of these are good or bad inherently, but they might lead to different outcomes depending on how your environment, again, is interacting with these things. One other idea that I want to mention, another sort of take on personality that really fits into that Kurt Lewin's equation that I brought up earlier, that behavior is a function of the person and the situation. This gets to how those things interact. The person and the situation really interact. Based on this idea from a researcher at University of Minnesota, actually named Mark Snyder, called self-monitoring, that we all essentially vary on the degree to which our personalities are expressed in our behaviors, depending on the situation. So self-monitoring, the degree to which a person assesses situations and adjusts their behavior accordingly. High self-monitors tend to be very aware of norms and situational demands, and they fit into those demands. They act like kind of social chameleons and do what the situation calls for. Low self-monitors are going to be people that act more true to themselves. They act consistently across different situations, and they might even be less aware of social norms in a lot of senses. So we all, not only do we differ on extroversion and openness and need for cognition and locus of control and all these things, we also differ on our degree of self-monitoring. And so that means we vary on the degree to which our personalities come out in different situations. High self-monitors might have less of a personality effect on their behavior because they're looking at the situations and the norms. Low self-monitors, they might find that their personality predicts more of their behavior because they're acting true to themselves across different situations. And I'm going to wrap up the unit in the next video.